In our discussion of the brain regions, first and foremost, we'll focus on the anatomy and the functions of the cerebrum. So recall that the cerebrum forms the vast majority of the brain, and it clocks in at an impressive 83% of the total brain mass. We see that the cerebrum is divided anatomically into two hemispheres, the right and the left hemisphere, and each of those hemispheres is then further subdivided into 5 lobes. So we're going to see that each lobe performs a variety of functions, but overall the cerebrum is typically referred to as the executive suite of brain processes because the cerebrum is where these higher level thinking, learning, and processing tasks are occurring within the brain. So the cerebrum overall also gives us an awareness of ourselves, an awareness of our sensations and our perceptions. It gives us our ability to speak and communicate. It also has functions involved in remembering, memory formation, understanding, and the cerebrum also controls skeletal muscle movement as well. So recall that the cerebrum is divided into right and left halves, and we call those right and left halves the cerebral hemispheres. So this would be, since this is the anterior up towards the top here, this would be the left cerebral hemisphere, and this would be the right cerebral hemisphere. And then we see that each hemisphere is further subdivided into 5 cerebral lobes. The first 4 lobes are superficially located, and they are seen here, and they are quite simply named for the cranial bones that are found above these lobes. So the frontal lobe is found just behind the frontal bone. Parietal lobe is found just deep to the parietal bone. Occipital lobe at the posterior part of the brain is located just deep to the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe in teal here makes up the lateral aspect of the brain and is found just underneath the temporal bone. We also see that there's a 5th lobe that is deep within the cerebrum, and this is called the insula, or the insular lobe. It is found deep to the junction between the frontal, the parietal, and the temporal lobes. The frontal lobe would be here in red, the parietal lobe would be here in kind of a lighter blue color, and the temporal lobe in the darker blue color. So if we look deep between the junction of those three cerebral lobes, we would find the insular lobe. We also have a number of grooves or sulci that make up the borders between different lobes here. So the central sulcus is the primary border between the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is anterior of the central sulcus, and the parietal lobe is posterior of the central sulcus. Meanwhile, the lateral sulcus is the border between the temporal lobe and the parietal and frontal lobes there. So it forms the boundary of the border between the temporal lobe and the frontal and parietal lobes that are near it. There is also a superficial and deep organization to the cerebrum. So superficially, we see that there's a thin layer of gray material that's referred to as the cerebral cortex, while the deep matter is white in color. So what we see in the cerebral cortex is that the cortex mostly consists of billions of neuron cell bodies, dendrites, associated glial cells, blood vessels, and things like that. Whereas the deep white matter is mainly composed of very heavily myelinated neuron axons that connect different regions of the cerebrum to one another. And they also connect the cerebrum, these white matter tracts and white matter axons also connect the cerebrum to other body and other body structures and other brain structures as well. So the cortex, the cerebral cortex, is where cerebral processing occurs, and it's the cerebral cortex that gives us the awareness of ourselves and our environment and awareness of our sensations. And just like we mentioned earlier, it allows us to communicate, remember, understand, interpret sensory information, and also initiate those voluntary skeletal muscle movements that we're consciously capable of doing. So we see that things like functional MRI or fMRI can give us kind of an approximation of active areas of the brain, as what fMRI can do for us is that it can measure variables like increased blood flow to certain regions of the brain during different activities. So for instance, we see increased blood flow and activity in the occipital lobe when we are viewing a visual stimulus, because The occipital lobe is where visual stimuli are interpreted. We see increased activity in the temporal lobe during an auditory stimulus, because the temporal lobe is primarily where auditory sound stimuli are interpreted. And we also see that other functional areas are active during tasks as well. And so what this is showing overall is that different regions of the brain are involved in different tasks. So the whole brain isn't just a mix of tasks. There are very specific areas that handle very specific tasks and functions. So overall, we see that the cerebral cortex functions in both the integration and motor output functions of the nervous system. So recall that integration is the interpretation of stimuli, where stimuli are given meaning, or a particular stimulus is given meaning based on the stimuli that the brain is currently receiving, and it also uses past experience to give meaning to that particular stimulus. Whereas motor output is going to control things like skeletal muscles. So we see that each hemisphere of the cerebrum is concerned with both sensory and motor functions of the contralateral side of the body. So that is the left cerebral hemisphere senses and controls the right side of the body, whereas the right cerebral hemisphere senses and controls the left side of the body. So contralateral in this case means opposite side of the body. One thing to note here is that integration is also referred to as association. So you may see integration areas of the cerebrum referred to as association areas. So this is the function that produces a deeper understanding of that incoming sensory information. So for instance, a good example of this is understanding what a key is, right? A key that opens a locked door. So recognizing the shape and the form, not only recognizing the shape and the form of the key from the stimuli that our eyes and our hands bring to our cerebrum, but also making the connection, the deeper connection as to what the function of keys are from our past experience. So all of this information is put together within the cortex to produce this deeper understanding of objects. And so the association functions and the association areas of the cerebrum also explain why things like inanimate objects like clouds can look like animals or other familiar objects or shapes to us, because we have those association areas that make those connections to our past experiences. So now that we've explored that, let's turn our attention to the different cerebral lobes and the specific functions within those cerebral lobes. So let's take a look at what the functions of the frontal lobe are. So overall, the frontal lobe is going to control all of our voluntary motor functions. It's also tasked with learning, working memory for completing tasks, managing our tasks, planning, judgment, reasoning, and it's also sites in the brain that give us our personality or processing for personality. So one of the structures that we're going to take a look at in the frontal lobe is a structure called the precentral gyrus. So remember, the gyri are the raised ridges that we see on the cerebrum. And the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe has the function of what's called the primary motor cortex. And so the primary motor cortex, this means that this is the region of the brain that controls all voluntary skeletal muscle movements. And just in front of it, or just anterior to that precentral gyrus, we see an area or region called the premotor cortex, and the premotor cortex helps to plan body movements. In turning our attention back to that precentral gyrus, we see that the entire body is represented spatially in the primary motor cortex of each cerebral hemisphere. So for instance, the neurons that control foot movements are in a very specific location on that precentral gyrus, and they're also in a different part of the precentral gyrus than the neurons that control things like the hand. So the figure that you see mapped out here has been drawn in an exaggerated way to illustrate the number of neurons in that part of the precentral gyrus that are devoted to control of those structures. So where the image is small, so like the arm, wrist, elbow, shoulder, that kind of thing, this means that there are relatively few neurons that are controlling the movements of those structures compared to structures that are drawn much larger. So in looking at this diagram, it is easy to see that things like the fingers and the inferior lower part of the face have a very high number of motor neurons that are devoted to controlling very precise movements of these two structures. So the more neurons that we have controlling the muscles in these regions, the more precise control we can have. So it kind of makes sense that the fingers in the lower part of the face, the movements there can be controlled very carefully and very precisely. We also see other motor regions in the frontal lobe. So another one of these motor regions is called Broca's area. And Broca's area, which is right here, functions as the motor speech region of the frontal lobe. So that means that it controls the skeletal muscles of the mouth and the throat that are involved in producing speech. It also appears to be involved in the planning of motor speech, and it also does have some other non-speech motor processes, so other non-speech skeletal muscle control associated with it. Broca's area is typically only found on the left frontal lobe, so it's usually only found on one of the hemispheres of the brain. Typically, it's on the left side, but occasionally, very rarely, it is found on the right frontal lobe of some individuals. So now that we've looked at the functions of the frontal lobe, let's turn our attention to the parietal lobe and look at the functions of this structure. The parietal lobe contains two areas that are involved with somatic sensation. So when we say somatic, we mean body sensation or general sensation from the body. So things like touch, temperature, and pressure, and things like that. The primary somatosensory cortex is the function of this structure right here, which is called the postcentral gyrus. So it's just posterior to that central sulcus. The somatosensory cortex receives general sensory information from things like the skin, the skeletal muscles, the joints, the tendons, ligaments, and other tissues like that. And these senses really help to tell the brain about the body's position in space and just kind of what's going on in those structures. So recall that senses from the right side of the body are sent to the left cerebral hemisphere, and they will be sent to the left somatosensory cortex, and senses from the left side of the body are sent to the right somatosensory cortex for interpretation. And again, here we also see that the more sensory receptors that a particular part of the body has, the larger the area in the somatosensory cortex that is devoted to receiving inputs from these areas and interpreting them. And so for that reason, we see that the things like the lower part of the face and the fingertips have very large areas of the postcentral gyrus that are devoted to receiving sensory input from those structures compared to any other part of the body. The somatosensory association cortex functions to interpret things like temperature, pressure, and other sensations, and it relays them to the primary somatosensory cortex, and together this helps produce an understanding of the object or the stimulus that is being felt or touched, so things like size, texture, and things like that. The somatosensory association cortex is just posterior to the primary somatosensory cortex. So that's where we see the primary somatosensory association area. So a good example of the link between the somatosensory association cortex and the primary somatosensory cortex is like if you think about reaching into your pocket, right? Your fingers can identify these small metal discs, right? And those you know from past experience that those small metal discs are coins based on your previous experiences with those coins and the sensory information that your fingertips are gathering at that particular point in time. Small metal, probably cold objects, right, that are flattened and rounded at their edges. So even though you are not directly looking at those objects, you can identify them as coins because of the communication between the somatosensory association area and the primary somatosensory cortex. So if a person were to damage the somatosensory association area of the brain, they would not be able to identify objects based on touch alone. They would actually have to physically see that object in order to be able to identify it. Because the link between the sensation that's coming into their brain and the association, the deeper understanding, and the past experience with those objects, that connection is no longer there, and so they would have to actually see that object in order to be able to identify it. So just as we saw with the precentral gyrus, which controls, which is the region of the brain that's the main area for controlling all of our voluntary skeletal muscle movements, we also see that the entire body is represented spatially on the postcentral gyrus. So that's the primary somatosensory cortex. For example, the neurons that sense general stimuli from the neck are in a different location on the gyrus than neurons that sense stimuli from the leg or from the nose or something like that, right? So again, this diagram here, this little map of the body, has been drawn in an exaggerated way to illustrate the number of neurons that are devoted to sensing particular parts of the body. So the larger a structure is drawn, means that there are a higher number of neurons in that part of the somatosensory cortex that are receiving sensory information from that part of the body, compared to things like smaller structure or the structures that are drawn in a smaller size. So what we can get again from this diagram, just like we did with the primary motor cortex, is that the inferior parts of the face and the head, along with the fingers and the hand, are more sensitive to stimuli than other parts of the body, like the leg or the knee, or even the neck, and things like that. So continuing on with the lobes of the cerebrum, we'll take a look at the functions of the temporal lobe, which is highlighted here in teal, and it again makes up kind of the lateral, essentially the lateral part of the cerebrum, essentially just deep to the temporal lobe and above the ear. So the temporal lobe has has areas for interpreting and associating hearing, which is auditory information, and smell or olfactory information, which is not labeled on this particular diagram, but it is one of the senses that is interpreted and associated in the temporal lobe. So we have regions that are in the temporal lobe that are devoted to interpreting sound and smell sensory information. So the auditory cortex is the part of the temporal lobe where sound sensory information from the ears is interpreted as things like pitch, loudness, and location with respect to the head. The auditory association area, which is just behind the primary auditory cortex, helps us to interpret the sounds that we hear. So is that sound somebody speaking? Is that sound music? Is that sound a loud noise? Other things like that. And it also helps us, right, the association area, just like the other association areas that we've talked about so far, helps us to give meaning to those sounds and what that means to us. The primary olfactory cortex is the region of the temporal lobe that is responsible for the awareness of things like different odors, different scents, strength of those different odors and scents and things like that. This region is actually located on the inner kind of medial aspect of the temporal lobe, so it's not visible from the superficial images of the brain. We've had to take a what's called a parasagittal view here. So we didn't section quite along the midline, but we sectioned a little bit off of the midline in order to be able to see the primary olfactory cortex. So interestingly, the primary olfactory cortex is located within a functional region of the brain that's called the limbic system. And the limbic system is largely responsible for emotions and memory formation. So this explains why certain odors and smells can evoke emotional responses, and they can do so more than any of the other special senses like visual or auditory senses, because visual and auditory senses are not kind of embedded within the limbic system like the olfactory cortex is. So moving on from the temporal lobe, we'll take a look at the last of the superficial lobes of the cerebrum. We'll take a look at the occipital lobe, which is located at the posterior aspect of the brain and sits just deep to the occipital bone. So the occipital lobe has areas that function in both visual interpretation and visual association. So the primary visual cortex is located on the deep kind of posterior and posterior regions of the occipital lobe, or I should say posterior superficial regions and posterior deep regions of the occipital lobe. So this area is actually responsible for detecting the visual stimuli that come from the retinas of the eye. And although it doesn't look like it, because the majority of the cortex is actually deep within the brain, so we're only seeing a little bit of it right here. In humans, this visual interpretation area is actually the largest of the cortical sensory areas in the human brain, at least. The visual association area, which is just which surrounds and is just anterior to the primary visual cortex. The visual association area actually covers most of the occipital lobe. This, like other association areas, uses past visual experiences, or I should say past experiences, but in this case, these are past visual experiences to interpret visual stimuli and give those stimuli meaning. So color, form, shape, movement of the object, and things like that. So it allows us to recognize objects from looking at them. And finally, the fifth lobe, the insula or the insular lobe, which is the deep lobe of the cerebrum, is where the gustatory cortex is located. And this cortex functions to perceive and interpret taste stimuli from the mouth and the tongue. So gustatory refers to the sensation of taste. And finally, wrapping up our discussion of the cerebrum, we take a look at the once again at the left and the right cerebral hemispheres. For the most part, these two cerebral hemispheres are actually separated from one another because even though they are close together in proximity to one another, there is not actually a lot of material that links the two hemispheres together, except for this structure right here, this large kind of upside down C-shaped structure right here called the corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum links or wires the left and the right cerebral hemispheres together. The corpus callosum in fresh brain tissue will actually look very white in color because the corpus callosum is mostly a large bundle of myelinated axons. So the corpus callosum, for the purposes of talking about the central nervous system, the corpus callosum is actually a large tract, because remember that tracts are bundles of axons within the central nervous system. So the myelinated axons within the corpus callosum link the gray matter between the two cerebral hemispheres, and this allows the two cerebral hemispheres to communicate with one another, but also function together as a unified whole.